Yasmine. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar. It's our first webinar as part of our Family Firms program as part of the Power Initiative. For this webinar, we've collaborated with Tharawat. Farida El Agamy is joining us from Tharawat, and she's the General Manager. We're holding this roundtable, this webinar, as the backdrop of our launching program that is set to launch in January 2020. We've had a long-standing relationship with Tharawat. In 2014, we authored a unique series of case studies on family business governance in the region, which was quite a success and is still being used and taught around the region. And based on the success of that event, we've recently collaborated on a second program. This year, we're actually directing our vision towards the future and are working together to explore how governance in our region may be affected by the shifts of the fourth industrial revolution. Of course, with the increased speed of decision making and the growing complexity of traditional industries, family firms today need to ensure that their governance structures are able to cope with the pace and requirements of the next economy. We're setting our focus mainly on the board of directors and how family businesses should look to adjust their boards so that they can continue being effective and efficient in an ever-changing environment. As such, as a prelude, our webinar today is on demystifying family business boards. We hope to have quite a practical discussion around family businesses, their governance structures, their boards, and bust a few myths, so to speak, around family business boards and governance and structures generally. While we are aware there's quite a lot to cover when you talk about family governance and family businesses, we'll try and address mainly the role of the board of directors, but we will touch upon the other different forums as well as part of the session. As usual, we encourage interactivity. So if there are any questions, please do use the live chat with questions and answers. We will try and address those throughout the hour that we're having this webinar. And yeah, so thank you very much. Thank you, Farida. Take it away.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Yasmine, for inviting me. It's truly something that's really close to the heart of Tharawat, but also to my heart personally, to talk about family business boards. Just for context, I'm a lawyer by training. I read law in the UK and in Switzerland. I worked as a corporate administrative and refugee lawyer in Switzerland for a while and have been with the Tharawat Family Business Forum for 10 years now. I currently sit on the board of our own family business in Switzerland, and I've had the privilege of advising and sitting on the boards of various other organizations over the years. And so the way I'd like you to understand my commentary is basically from a very practical perspective. I wanted to put together a couple of points that I kept seeing coming up both in North African, Levantine, and of course GCC family business boards, and also kind of have a conversation about what these observations mean, and also the challenges that we have with regards to a lack of regional and supra-regional and regional best practice. So my first slide it looks a bit funny, and the reason for that is that whenever we speak about governance in Tharawat, we try to visualize what governance can do. And one of the ways we do that is by illustrating that the fact of having unstructured, uncoordinated impacts on the family business is actually a very dangerous thing. As you can see, kind of very childishly illustrated from this slide, the reality is if every family member, every shareholder, stakeholder from the family has an uncoordinated impact into the family business, the output of the business might as well be very uncoordinated and very unstructured. So when we talk about good governance in Tharawat, we mean this. So we mean that on the one hand, family members are aligned. The influence of family members is aligned. As you can also see, we always put forward that every family member should be able to perform at the best of their talent and at the best of their ability. So not everybody is equal, and in governance, that's a very important aspect to look at. The second point that is very important to look at is the clarification of roles of family members in relation to each other, but also in relation to the business. So once you use governance to organize this, you have a unified voice into the business. And the result is that as a business, you can take more opportunities, you can take opportunities in a faster way, your decision-making is more streamlined, you increase your impact, and you create opportunities for sustainability and longevity. So this just gives you a bit of an overview of our approach towards what good governance in general means. But now diving into the topic of boards. We discussed with the Pearl Initiative that instead of having a lengthy technical discussion about what the Board of Directors means and what its impact is, that we would center the conversation around 4 myths that we have heard of, that we have encountered, that we have had to work with in our practice within Tharawat, as well as a family business ourselves. So the first myth that I'm going to address today is that the role of the Family Business Board is to control the management. The second one is that family business boards are owners' meetings. The third one is family business boards need independent directors. And please unclench your jaws if this is something that is controversial to you. And the fourth point is family business boards do not influence growth and sustainability. So what I'll be doing over the next couple of minutes is go through those 4 myths and kind of illustrate how we have observed those myths play out in the region, why we think some of them are quite dangerous to stick to, and why we think that a regional best practice can kind of clarify what we can do with those approaches. So the first one is something that we often hear from, obviously, within the family business. So the role of the board is to control the management. And sometimes this is said from a management perspective and a little bit with a grudge in terms of, you know, you only want to control operations. And on the other hand, it is said from a board perspective in terms of saying, yes, we need to control the board of the management and we need to be on top of them. Now let's look at how this really plays out. So to start off with, I wanted to show you a slide that is from a research paper by Rodriguez and Marquez. And as I'm sure many of you are experts in this field, and we've all seen many of these charts mapping out the family business structure, I really like this one. And I'll just take a moment to slowly go through it so that you understand why I really appreciate this structure. So first of all, it makes a big difference between family shareholders and family non-shareholders. And it shows how family shareholders are really the link between both the family governance structure, which is marked by the family assembly, family council, family committees, etc. And on the other hand, the more corporate structure, which basically has then the ownership governance structure around everything that's shareholders, and the corporate governance structure, which includes the board of directors and the whole management process. So this gives an option for us to kind of understand a little bit who are the players at an ownership level and how does this influence the corporate structures or the governance structures at the lower levels of the organization. So if you look at the left side, for example, you'll see that family shareholders and family non-shareholders both may have access to a family assembly. Now, This obviously varies from family business to family business. We have to be very clear here. I am not speaking of a clearly regulated organization or regulated legal structure here. I'm speaking of it in an abstract way. Every legal context will have different outputs will have different conditions for this, and every family will have different needs. So if you're from a family business, your family governance side might look very, very different. But perhaps you might recognize kind of similar structures with regards to having a larger assembly where both shareholders and non-shareholders meet and take decisions with regards to various topics. So when we go down into the family governance structure, one of the things I'd like to point out here is the positioning of the family office. Now, family offices have become very, very popular in the region. It originally, as we all know, is an Anglo-Saxon institution that really came out from, I would say, mostly the big industrial American and British industrial families that during the 19th and 20th century kind of created a lot of wealth, and then family members successively wanted to remove themselves from operating these companies and started really managing their wealth. Now, here in the region, we have to be very clear, the development is somewhat different. It has different needs and different perspectives and a different approach overall when it comes to the setup and the structure, and also the vision of a family office. But that's for another day. But I do like the fact that they put it in the family governance structure rather than in the corporate structure, which is something obviously that's open for debate for many families. On the right side of the slide, you can see family shareholders, and they give an option for shareholders not from the family. Now, this is obviously in most, especially Middle Eastern family businesses, when you talk about the family holding, it's unlikely that you'll have non-family shareholders. Perhaps you'll have it in lower areas, perhaps in subsidiaries where you have non-family partners. But here is the really important structure. So we have the shareholder assembly, then the board of directors that we are speaking about today, and then the CEO, who basically runs the day-to-day management and organizes all the assets that the company has. So in order to go forward, I simplified this structure and really wanted to just have a look at these three aspects. So the owners, the shareholders, the board of directors, and the executive management. And I think if we look at the next couple of slides, we will constantly have a conversation about the relationship of those three governance institutions. First of all, just to kind of agree with each other, that when I speak of a shareholder assembly, this could be called the annual general meeting, it could be called an owner's council. Again, depending on the legal structure, legal system that you operate in, you will have different requirements from a compliance perspective, but also depending on what your family business looks like, you might have to adjust certain requirements for your own family business. However, typically, shareholder assemblies will take place once a year. Board of directors vary a lot. They might take place from 1 to 4 times to 6 times a year. And then, of course, you have the executive management that is then set up according to the requirements of the industry, of the company, and according to what the executive management needs. Now, in terms of who sits in these spaces, yes?
Yeah, Farida, can I just ask you a quick question? Yes, it's Yasmine.
Sure.
So I just wanted to go back a slide. So just to distinguish between the role of the board of directors on a business level and the role of the family council on a family level. So what kind of decisions is a differentiator between the decisions that are made by the family council and those that are made by the board of directors? And why wouldn't, for example, the board of directors be able to make decisions in relation to the family office? And I understand that there's a softer elements of, the family retreats, etc., that don't necessarily warrant a board of directors decision. But for example, at a family office level, what would prevent a board of directors being comprised on the other side, family side?
So, yes, absolutely. I think that's an excellent question. And unfortunately, I don't have an exact answer for you. Again, this is not an exact science. And I think everybody needs to have a very clear look at their own business structure, at the requirements of the business and the needs of the family, and build the structure that is completely bespoke to them. So once again, I want to warn you, this structure that you see here, or this table that you see here, is a very, very generic depiction of what a family business corporate structure could look like. However, in a system where you clearly distinguish between the roles of the board of directors and the family council, what I would say is there is a certain advantage to that, especially if you have a very active business that requires a lot of attention. What happens when you mix or when you give the board of directors also the role to look after the family and make sure that the family's needs are met, is that it's almost inevitable that their attention is going to steer away from the business and is going to end up being focused on what the family needs, right? Because you're serving the shareholders, perhaps many of the board members are actually the family members. So you almost humanly cannot avoid being drawn, to these type of conversations rather than giving the support or supervising what the management is doing in the business. So I would say that if you were to say that you did not want to have a family governance structure set up, but that the board has a responsibility towards your family business or towards your family, that you would have to completely segregate that work from the core work of the board. So that would be my first comment. My second comment is if you were to segregate those two functions, the advantage is that your family council or whatever family, it could be the family assembly or whatever family institution you have, can really work closely with the family members, building a very clear understanding of what is required for each generation in the family to be basically performing at their best and having a positive impact on the business. Because ultimately that's what you want. You want a family that has a positive and clear working relationship or owner relationship with the business and not interfere with the day-to-day management unless obviously it is their role and their assigned clear duty to do so. Does that answer a little bit your question?
Yeah, certainly. And I know this is all subjective and my questions are loaded to a certain extent, don't worry. So thank you for that. Another question I have, on the topic of the board of directors, and this, obviously, I spent some time doing family business advisory consulting. Sure. I'd like to ask you your thoughts on the chairperson of the board of directors. So often the chairperson of the board of directors is appointed as the chairperson of the family council as well. So in order to maintain the link between the family and the business, and I know the diagram that you've used here has the family shareholders as the common link, but often they kind of have the chairperson of the board of directors, the chairperson of the family council, to maintain that link between the business but also managing the family affairs. What would your take on that be?
Well, you can maintain that link in different ways. I would say that it really depends on the culture of your family, on the position of the chairperson or of the designated chair people, whether that's a good idea or whether that's not a good idea. The advantage, definitely you've pointed it out, is that there is a coordination between the two institutions, and that might make it easier to harmonize decision-making within the business, taking into consideration direct family member feedback, and also making sure that, the results of the business are clearly communicated to the family, and then perhaps, perks or even educational decisions as well as employment decisions can be taken within the family council with the full introspection and understanding of someone who is also on the board of directors. The downside is that you concentrate a lot of power into one person. And again, it's a very individual decision that each family has to kind of reflect on and take what's right for them. If everybody agrees that that person is absolutely the right person to have a foot in both spaces, then definitely that can be a very good idea. But then always make sure that you have a backup plan, that in case that person retires, for example, that you have a clear procedure to say that you have a choice to then appoint one person to replace, or then perhaps 2 or 3 people to take up different roles that one person successfully managed. So I think here you have to be very, very aware of that if something works in governance under the leadership of one person, it might not do so under the leadership of other people. So you always have to have backup structures in your governance system that gives you an opportunity to review and reflect on the structure that you have in order to make sure that perhaps in the next generation you might want to have a split role or even a more kind of innovative way of organizing things. So I think just the fact that there is an openness to do that when a person retires already gives a lot of confidence of next generations into this system, rather than having that competition and that race of becoming that one person that basically controls all.
Perfect. Understood. Thank you.
My pleasure. So just to come back to the simplified structure. So why I like this simplified structure is because it points out one of the key topics that lead to misunderstanding between the responsibilities, for example, of shareholders, directors, and executive management. And that's on the far right side of the slide, which is the decision-making power. So what do we decide upon at each of these levels? And I think this is what we're going to come back to this slide a bit later. But I want you to keep in mind that it really depends on your decision-making matrix, that it is clear to distinguish the roles of the shareholder assembly, the board of directors, and the executive management. So, and again, we have obviously a lot of experts on the call, so I will not bore you too much with what the basic tasks of a board of directors is. And again, from a legal perspective and being a lawyer, I always kind of start from there. I think it always helps to have a look at the laws of the country, the regulations that you operate within, to get a sense of what does the law actually require a board of directors to do? Because sometimes we are surprised. I've been in more than one meeting where we had the good idea to actually start reading what the legal structure required a board of directors to do, and there were sometimes some surprises in terms of, oh yes, okay, so this is also a responsibility that we have. But overall, from a strategic perspective, I mean, obviously there is strategy. So the board of directors takes entrepreneurial leadership, which sometimes I think is a little bit forgotten and we become a bit institutionalized. But obviously, if the board of directors is not entrepreneurial, it's very difficult for the executive to be entrepreneurial and communicate that in partnership with the board of directors. Obviously, governance, everything that is on the one hand, legal compliance, which you see on the bottom left, and governance in general, to make sure that the flow of structures and processes is well organized and harmonizes with the requirements of the company. That's, I think, something that is really, really key with regards of the responsibility of the board of directors. A very important point, and as we've seen in the region over the past, I would say, 10 years, is ethical leadership. It is really essential that both ethical leadership as well as culture is led by the board of directors, and that there is a clear communication between the executives and the board of directors as to what is the culture of this organization. What do we stand for? What are our values? And I'm not talking about kind of mission and vision on the website. I'm talking about truly lived and implemented values. And those can be whatever you decided to be. However, they cannot be dormant. So if you decide as a board of directors that there are certain ethical guidelines, codes of conduct, and you implement those, you need to make sure that there is corporate discipline, that these they implement it. So I think that's a very important responsibility of the board of directors, because both ethical leadership and culture impact how we work, how fast we can take decisions, how much we trust each other within the corporate structure, and that ultimately should lead to higher output and performance. I've mentioned legal compliance, and obviously in link with that is, of course, risk management, which unfortunately I feel in kind of the non-corporate or the non-multinational organizations in this region is a bit weak. So risk management is something that has a reputation of being complex, that has a reputation of needing a lot of third-party support. But I do feel that we need to make sure that family businesses really stick to risk management and incorporate it even at a light level on the board. And then, of course, leadership in its widest possible scope. So talking about what is the long-term success? Where do we want this company to go? And here we also have the relationship with the owners, which I'm going to come back to in a minute.
All right.
So,
can I
yes.
just stop you here for a second? So the myth was that the role of the family business board is to control the management, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, in terms of a task, I know it's all framed legally by different laws and policies, etc. But that is presumably one of the tasks of the board. So it's not the sole, is this where we go? So it's not the sole responsibility, because I'm just looking at the questions from the audience. So one of our audience members has said, is this a myth or a reality? So I think we'd like to differentiate between what is actually happening on the ground potentially with a lot of organizations and what we would promote as should be happening, right?
Absolutely. And if you allow me just to go to the next slide, and I'll try to answer that question in the context of the next slide. So the next slide really comes back to that question exactly. So what is the myth here, and what is the reality, and how can we work towards a better understanding between the board of directors and the executives? Now, it is international best practice that a board doesn't only control executives, but also support. And I believe one of the things that we sometimes miss out on in the region is the support angle. And I have a quick story that I can relate to you. An acquaintance of mine works in his family business, and they decided to change around the board. And for about 10 years of his career, he's the CEO, he was really always so anxious to go and meet the board, right? It was only anxiety. There was no positive feelings. It was literally about, how much am I going to get battered by them? How much are they going to criticize what we do, etc. Now, they changed the board structure. I'm not going to go into details, but it was quite a substantial turnaround or change. And after, I would say, about 3 or 4 board meetings, we had a conversation, and he said, it is incredible how different it feels to go to a board that, yes, absolutely takes their control function very seriously, looks at basically every element of compliance and financial risk, etc. But then at the same time has in equal measure takes time for support and positive reinforcement. And I think this is where boards need to balance between control and support, because otherwise you are really going to just limit also the creativity of your executives. We obviously don't want them to get too creative, but you need to foster the entrepreneurial spirit, especially if you're in a growth phase, and you should maintain that strict, rigid regime of discipline and governance implementation, of course, but then you also need the almost intangible support systems that the executives need in order to perform at their best level. So this is kind of where perhaps that might answer your question, Yasmine?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Farida.
Okay. So really what we are looking to try and achieve is a high-performing board of directors. And when we say high-performing, that means not in terms of how many documents they read or how many meetings they have, but really to outperform when it comes to that control and support. And there are various elements that we can take into consideration, perhaps with board composition. So one piece of research says that having 30 to 40% of board members that are only there because of their industry expertise, and we will talk about independent board members in a minute, but that really helps with regards to the support function, because these are people who basically do not have any emotional ties with the organization and are purely there to give technical or industry support. A very important point to look at, and I'm at the lower part of the left side of the slide, is the balance of power between the CEO and the directors. So again, it's all about how you manage the relationship between the CEO and the directors. And you shouldn't tend to either becoming a CEO's board. So obviously, you want to have a board that challenges the CEO, that supervises their activities, but then you also don't want to become an owner's board that basically only sits there and defends the interests of the owners, almost antagonizing the CEO. So it's always about finding a balance. And what's the healthiest thing to do, if you look at the right side of the slide, is that continuity in that sense is important because you need to build relationships, you need to build a culture in the board, but then also periodic change is healthy. So this is where in family business boards sometimes we fall short because we kind of consider those boards as almost a shareholder representation right. And that means that very often they stay very static and have only very few changes across the appointment period of a CEO. So that is something that, and also, for example, that opens a bracket that I'm very passionate about as well, is the non-family CEO, right? Very often, and research shows that in Europe and the US, that non-family CEOs fail very often because of the lack of strong relationship between the board and their executive team. And because if you bring in a CEO that comes from, let's say, a more corporate structure, a more multinational structure, they are used to a certain relationship that is there with the board and their teams. And in a family business, sometimes that is not possible because of the static nature of these boards. But I'll come back to that because the static nature of family business boards seems to also have advantages. So we have to be careful not to just look at that as a negative point. And the last two points that yes.
Yeah, I think you touched on a good point there, and I think you're going to cover it in the next slide. But often what we see is that when family members are appointing board members, so there are obviously different branches of a family when it comes to the second or the third generation. So each branch, so that the uncles group and the uncles group and the aunties group all appoint a representative board member to represent their rights. And that's not necessarily where it should be happening, the shareholder representation again, but on the shareholders assembly, right?
Exactly. So I think, yes, we'll come to that actually in a second, because that's the question of, should the board of directors be a shareholder assembly, basically. And I think we can debate that in a bit with the next slide. The two last points here with regards to a high-performing board of directors is, on the one hand, the readiness for crisis. And I think here crisis preparedness is, in my opinion and in my observation, very much lacking in this region. Even though, in a one hand, I mean, it's quite interesting because a lot of family businesses actually operate in regions that are in constant crisis. So you would say that it is probably something that they're very used to and that they navigate very successfully, otherwise they wouldn't be here. However, I think to have a crisis preparedness strategy at the board level really helps, because then it's not only left to kind of ad hoc conversations between the CEO and the board of directors, but it actually is a strategy that trickles then down into the organization and can maybe perhaps even indicate advanced alarm systems when it comes to crisis prevention. And the last point here is to be in touch with the front line. So, and this is a very European and American concept that I haven't really seen, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I haven't really seen this in this region, is to have, for example, board question times for employees, that the board is much more visible. For example, there's a company that I know in Switzerland that holds board meetings in the factory, and part of the board meeting is held during working hours of the factory workers, so that there is this kind of visible connectivity between the board and the employees. So, I mean, this is where you can become quite creative to make sure that your board is not just literally, meeting 4 times a year in a resort away from operations, but has some sort of connectivity to the family business operations on a day-to-day basis. All right. So, what's the second myth that we wanted to talk about? And thank you for the segue, Yasmina. This is literally one that we wanted to talk about, which is that family business boards are owners' meetings. And this is not something that people would obviously say out loud, but observing so many boards over the past 10 years in the region, it is often a reality. And I want to come back to this slide with a bit more fancy colors this time, because we need to build or rebuild this relationship between shareholder assemblies and board of directors, I feel. Probably out of convenience and out of decision-making speed, we kind of pool a lot of power and a lot of responsibility into the board of directors in family firms in our region. However, we are also missing out on the advantage of having a 2-tier system. Now, for example, if you look at the German system, which I know quite well, you even have a 3rd tier. So you would have the shareholder assembly, and then you have a supervisory board, a board of directors, and then executive management. And the effect of that in Germany is that you have kind of really taken advantage of those checks and balances, but in the positive way. So not in the restrictive way, because each one of the boards has a different function and a different task towards the company. Now, in the Anglo-Saxon system, we obviously have this 2-tier system where we have shareholder assembly and board of directors. But in our region, often the shareholder assembly is implemented at its minimum. So we often, perhaps the shareholders will meet, but it will not really be a meeting, or we just come together to look at the financials, sign a couple of documents, and then leave. I've also encountered a lot of passive members or passive owners who basically don't even go to the assemblies and delegate all their decision-making power to other people. Now, there are 2 things here that I want to point out. The first one, and I'm starting from the top in the yellow bar, is to look at what influences this relationship. On the one hand, we obviously have our regulatory framework. So the laws of the land that apply to whatever company or corporate structure you have. And the first step is to look at how the laws distinguish between the responsibilities of a board of directors and the responsibilities of a shareholder assembly. And then obviously we have to make sure that there is compliance, legal compliance with regards to that. Once that is done, then I would look at corporate governance best practice and really reflect what can we take from this relationship that will actually help us with a better company, build a better company, have better growth, and have more impact. And again, it's this distinction between what are really the high-level decisions. If you think of who sits on in a shareholder assembly, it's the shareholders, aka investors. So the way they look at the company should be very different from people who are on the board of directors, because the board of directors, as we said, their main goal is to support and control the executive management in the best interest of all shareholders. So here you cannot, even if, and this is where, I mean, sometimes I feel like even being a member in a family business, sometimes you have so many different roles, it's really difficult to distinguish which hat you're wearing at which moment. So it is really important that when people sit on the board of directors, that they take off the hat of shareholder and become a director with all the legal consequences, because obviously directors have legal responsibilities, but the main responsibility they have is to support and control the management in the interest of all shareholders, right? So that's a very different behavior than being a shareholder in a shareholders assembly and trying to define what is the long-term goal for this, our investment, our family investment, this operating company that technically is an investment of ours, right? So this is why I wanted to highlight that. And In my opinion, it absolutely should not be the case that the board of directors is an owner's council. If it is, then you need to start planning for kind of slowly dissecting which decisions should be taken by the shareholders, which decisions should be taken by the directors, and perhaps suggest a shift in culture with regards to what you discuss in which space. All right. Any questions, Yasmina, or comments?
No, not yet. We have some more general ones, but I'll leave those to the end.
Okay, perfect. All right. So what's the third myth? Family business boards need independent directors. And I will clarify why I think that this is a myth. So I don't know if this is probably quite small for many of you. I apologize for the font size. But before we dive into the conversation, whether we need independent directors and what type we need, I'd like to just clarify the terminology that I use. When I speak about independent directors, I mean, and you can see that in the green box, I mean non-executive directors that have no meaningful connection to the company. So these are people that are not shareholders, do not have any other financial stake in the company, are not family members, do not have or have never had employment ties, and don't have relationships or family relationships or other relationships with any of the shareholders of the company, its directors or employees, right? So independent directors are actually quite rare, because usually when you look around on boards, and here I'm including boards of directors in the Western world, it's very rare that you really see technocrats sitting on boards, unless they are there for very specific purposes. What you often see is, if we go up on in this chart, you typically have your inside director, so with a meaningful connection to the company. So this could be, for example, your executive director who's a member of the management team. You could have an inside director that is a non-executive director, so these are perhaps large shareholders or employees or employee representations. This is very European. But they might be non-executive directors, but they still have very close relations to the company. Typically in the region, what we always see is that there is one, probably only one, trusted advisor that sits on this board and probably stays there for a decade or even a couple of decades. So that's your kind of typical non-executive director, but it's an inside director. Now, the comparison to that, the non-executive director who's an independent director has none of that. So it's a completely independent person. Yeah. So when I speak going forward of the independent director, I really mean that this particular profile. So a person who has no other connection to the company. And so we've seen in the recent years that there is a general call for more independent directors on board, and specifically in family business boards, because it is often seen as a way to perhaps break that rigid structure of family members sitting on the board, not moving, and bringing a bit of dynamic or dynamism into the board meetings and the board conversation. And I think that's absolutely correct. It is very important to have that diversity, and it's very important to have independent directors on the board. But I want to refer to my next slide, and this is by John Davis, 3 points that John Davis wrote in 2006 about the board of directors and the composition, because that's basically what we're talking about here, is how should I best compose my board of directors? And I think in family businesses, John Davis, obviously a huge expert and guiding academic in this field, he said 3 things that I think are very relevant. The first one is board seats should be earned and must not be inherited. Now, this is already the first hurdle, right? So how do we make sure that in our family business, we move from a shareholder representation model to a meritocracy with regards to the board seat, so that from the family, the right person for the right reasons have a board seat. And this is why, just going back to my comments about the relationship between the shareholder assembly and the board of directors, this is why it's so important that you have that relationship. Because what you want to do is that shareholders always feel heard and represented in the shareholders assembly, and that decisions and guidance from the shareholder assembly is taken seriously and properly and officially communicated to the board of directors. And this is when you see that there is a relaxation in the structure, because then not everybody, every shareholder feels that they need a board seat in order to feel secure in their role and in their rights. Yes, Yasmine?
Correct. I think I'd also like to add on that point. So, I mean, I think appointing independent or even non-executive directors, I mean, is a case of, I mean, maturity of a business. So depending on practices and what they're used to. And I think it's a big decision, especially for the operations. I mean, when the organizations haven't been very institutionalized and I don't want to say run very autocratically, but I mean, when you've got one founder making decisions, it's a big step to appoint an independent director. So, I mean, and it takes a certain level of maturity to accept and allow that person to have a decision-making responsibility on your board. What I've seen, I think, which is quite successful regionally, is advisory boards. So and I mean, this is not an either-or situation, but I think that having an advisory board with trusted advisors that can provide a sounding board, they know their position in that they're just advisors. It's not that they will be contributing to a final decision-making vote per se, but they can contribute their thoughts, and then they can contribute. It's up to the board, the founder, the shareholders to take those decisions on board. But until they get to that level where they can accept outsider thinking opinions, the advisory board is a good interim solution as well.
That's a very good point, and I think it leads to the next point, point 2, where John Davis says that boards gain from diversity, which is now, I think, universally accepted. And so I think this focus on independent members or independent directors is absolutely correct with regards to diversity. Family business boards, in order to be the right institutions to help the executives go forward in this very complex 21st century, need diversity, right? We need to make sure that there are different voices that kind of complement each other and that help the board formulate the guidance, on the one hand the supervision, and of course then also the guidance and the support that helps the executive team take the right decisions. And the third point is, and I feel this, I mean, I've mentioned this before, but I really, really think this is something that we absolutely have to emphasize in this region, is that when you are a director, you are legally required to represent the interests of the company and all owners. So you cannot represent your own interests or only basically the branch of the family that you represent. And I can tell you, I mean, there are European families that are struggling with this. There are American families that are struggling with this. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, and it has to do with the complexity of being a family business member and carrying different hats. And I think this is where the board culture and the board processes can really help, that those members of the family that are on the board of directors do take that task very seriously, on the one hand, and on the other hand, this also guides us towards having more independent or non-executive directors on your board, because it is much easier for them, because they are paid for a certain job and a certain function. Their onboarding has been done properly, then they understand what the interests are of the company and what the interests are of the shareholders. So this really is a point that I think we need to focus on a lot in this region.
All right. We have a question, Farida.
Yes.
We have a question. So you've kind of answered it with regards to the board, but someone's asked, what course of action should be taken if a CEO is asked to side with one owner over another?
That's like a recruitment question. Don't answer it. No, I think it's that's one of the toughest situations you can find yourself in, both whether if the CEO is a family member, but more specifically if the CEO is a non-family member. If the CEO is a family member, you can use your knowledge and your, expertise, your understanding of the family culture and kind of the history of the family to perhaps, mitigate the situation, right? Because you have other spaces that you meet these people in. Now, if you're a non-family CEO, of course, that's where it becomes very, very complex. And that's where I think the first step that I would recommend you do is to go back to the drawing board and really look at your responsibility as an executive to act in the best interest of the organization. And then really try to keep the conversation at very rational, fact-based, financial-based conversations or matters, and trying to explain to those two people that the way that they propose you go forward might be damaging to the organization. But again, saying that is very easy. Doing it is a high level. I mean, that's for me high diplomacy. And I definitely don't envy any CEO that's in the position like that. Just from a philosophical or from a strategy perspective, you want to avoid these situations. And the way you can do that is by building a board culture where the board directors really understand what their task is, and that their task is not to act in their own interest and in their own best interest. But again, that's kind of a philosophical answer to a factual question. But I think, going back to basics, looking at what's really important for the company, and always putting yourself on the side of the company and explaining to them that you're doing that because it's in their own self-interest.
Perfect. I think that answers the question. But I'm also conscious of time.
Yes, exactly.
So we might be able to take it offline.
Yeah, exactly. I'll be happy to have a chat about that and hear opinions about this problem. So the fourth point, or the fourth myth that we wanted to address is that sometimes I've heard family businesses be so desperate about the quality of their board of directors that they say, anyways, our board of directors has absolutely no influence on the growth or sustainability of our organization. And so I would like to slightly debunk this myth, because of course the board of directors has an essential role in terms of the sustainability or the growth of a family business. And I think we can also see, if we look at it from a negative perspective, that the board failures across the world have led clearly to very damaging outcomes in different companies around the world, and both multinational structures, publicly owned companies, as well as family businesses. So I think we cannot underestimate the role of the board of directors. And it's a very complex myth to debunk, I would say. But what I wanted to do is share with you one piece of research that was done in the UK. And I want to be very clear. I usually hesitate to bring in Western research to prove something to a regional context. But I think this is such a really, really interesting piece of research that I think that we can all kind of take away from it what we think is relevant in our regional, cultural, and legal context. So it's a study conducted by Professor Wright, Professor Wilson, and Professor Scholes, and it researched a data set of 700,000 private, family and non-family firms in the UK. I think the split was about 50-50. They looked at them over the years of 2007 to 2010, so the years of the financial crisis. And what they wanted to look at is the topic of family business survival and growth and the role of boards. So an extremely, extremely interesting conversation. And what I'm going to do, I mean, it's a piece of research of about 50 pages, and I really encourage you, and I'm happy to share it with you, encourage you to go through it, because really the outcomes that they've made and also the questions that they ask for further research are really topical. So very quickly, what are the learning points from the study? So their big takeaway is family firms have a significantly lower failure rate than non-family companies. And I think that's very, very, it's something that we all kind of live with as a reality, but I think it's beautiful to have it outline this clearly based on such a huge sample over such a difficult time. So I think this is very interesting. So interestingly enough, family firms have fewer outside directors compared to non-family firms. So again, just for context, here we're talking purely UK sample. And the reason for that is that family businesses seem to appreciate directors, and they can be non-executive directors, they can be non-family directors, but they do appreciate directors that do have some sort of connection to the company. And one of the takeaways that I found very interesting is that apparently outside directors or independent directors encouraged riskier activities, but then would not stick around to resolving the problems. And I think this is something that goes against family business culture, right? You stick it out. That's kind of what makes them so sustainable. The second point is that family firms are likely to have older and more experienced boards. Now, I want to caution here. This does not mean that we want to have the static boards that we sometimes see across the wider region and in other areas of the world, where basically your board seat is for life. That's not what they mean. But what they mean is that you have to look at experience and acquire the right experience for your board of directors at the right time. Apparently in the UK, family firms have more female directors than non-family firms. And they clearly make a very clear connection to sustainability and diversity on the board. So obviously, female directors is only one element of diversity that we're looking at. And the fourth point is that family boards tend to have greater human and social capital. And I think this point really, again, points once more to the fact that actually having intangible and soft skills is as important as the hard skills that we usually look for, industry experience or shareholder ties, etc. So just to summarize some learning points, what had a positive impact, according to the professors, on sustainability? It was that larger board size was more, interestingly enough, more efficient. Age and experience of directors was very important, and the spread of age was much higher than in non-family boards. So again, I want to emphasize, we're not talking about the older the better, which sometimes might be the case, but here we are talking about the spread of age that is represented on the board, and that kind of led to positive feedback. Gender diversity, and of course, director location, but also networks. So they would choose people, or people on the board would have multiple directorships and therefore also be able to network for the company. Very quickly, negative impact on sustainability was board instability, previous failure experiences, and the ratio of independent directors. So I'm talking not non-executive, I'm talking about independent directors. And I think that's pretty much it from my side, Yasmine. And obviously, it's a topic that we can talk about for hours. It's something that's really kind of a passion for us, and I think that's where we link so well with the Pearl Initiative. And I'm very aware that obviously we've only kind of seen the tip of the iceberg here, but I'm very happy to take any questions or have a follow-up discussion with anyone.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Farida. I think there's a lot to be done in the realm of family governance, so I'm looking forward to our collaboration going forward. And I think given the interest in this webinar, we might have to do a series. Thank you for volunteering, Farida. But no,
I was just being polite.
I think just to summarize, I think the question of is this myth or reality? Yes. Unfortunately, they are myths, but it might be the reality of what's happening. So I hope we've debunked some of those and put kind of a bit more guidance on what we would recommend and suggest. Thank you for that, Farida. Just before we conclude, just wanted to mention we are going to conduct a study for boards of the future. It's going to consist of some research. The output's going to be a publication with a practical section as well as insights, and we're also going to hold follow-up workshops around the themes that we identified in the research. So practical workshops for family member next gen themselves. We have a roundtable as well coming up at the end of, well, on the 19th of December. That will be held in Dubai. So we'd appreciate it if you could make it, or you'd like to know more information, let us know. As always, Partnership team, Tharawat team are available to you. So if there's any other questions, any afterthoughts that you have, we'll be happy to answer those. Thank you all for dialing in, signing in, attending. And hopefully we look forward to seeing you at the event in December. Thank you
very much
again, the Tharawat team.
Bye. Of course, anytime. Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.